My name's Zoe. I am the head of the political section at the British High Commission in Kenya, but previously I've worked for the UK and also the UN and a number of other organisations in Sudan, South Sudan, and for quite some time in Ethiopia. So we are discussing a lot of issues that I've spent my career working on. I'd like to firstly welcome my panel. With many thanks, Martha Bakwesegha is with Life and Peace Institute. She has 20 years of experience working with international and African organizations in the region and currently works for LPI as their Senior Global Peace Building and Policy Advisor and coordinates the Horn Programme. Dr. Chido Mutangadura works with the United Nations University, specifically with the Secretariat for the High Level Advisory Board on Effective Multilateralism. And Dr. Abel Abate is a Chatham House fellow and former colleague of mine advising the UK government. Some of them had late night journeys to get here, so thank you very much for them for making it and for joining us this morning. So our panel is focusing on responses of policy actors to conflicts in the region, and much of the material that we're going to talk about has already been touched on by the first panel. So what we're going to do is aim to keep our interventions as short as possible and then get into more discussion. And it will not be a surprise to you that we do not have all of the solutions for policy actors in relation to the multiplicity of issues that we discussed this morning. So please feel free to bring your proposals from the floor. A reminder of some of the key points that we've just discussed, and then I'll hand over to Martha. We talked about the collapse of the two hegemonic states and how their sort of collapse into conflict has demonstrated the interconnectedness of the conflicts and spread beyond the borders of those states. We've talked about the need for a wider regional outlook, both in terms of understanding the impacts of conflict and the responses. And obviously, we've talked about the regional institutions and their approaches or lack of capacity to manage the impacts. So Martha is going to kick us off, and she's going to pick up on some of the discussion that we just left off, looking particularly at the institutions in the region and the role of civilian actors. And then Chido is going to talk about military operations as a policy tool, particularly thinking about the East African community. And then Abel is going to do a little bit of a deeper dive onto the Ethiopian conflict. I'm going to try and keep it to 5 or so minutes each, and then it'll be over to you for questions and interventions from the floor. Thanks, Martha.
Thank you, Zoe. Good morning to everyone. I'm definitely happy to be here. I think sitting in on the conversations earlier this morning, very rich and very vibrant. But I have to also admit that one of the reasons why we're keeping this short is because a lot of what we were asked to discuss was already raised. So very good to see that we have lots of visionaries who can predict things that we're actually supposed to discuss in the room today. So my presentation looking at regional responses to the conflict in the Horn, I start off by agreeing that I think from the perspective of the Horn, we are definitely in trouble. The African Union slogan of silencing the guns, I think 2020 was it? We're in 2023, and I think we can all agree that the guns are much louder. Particularly when it comes to the Horn of Africa. The Horn definitely is in turmoil, there's no question about it. The Horn definitely is fragile, as was mentioned by the presenters earlier this morning. The Horn is not politically coherent. It spends more time, I think countries or member states spend more time competing within themselves and spend less time navigating towards collective interest, collective action, and solutions. And as Zoe mentioned, we will not have the solutions necessarily here. But I think the purpose of my intervention here at the moment is to also pick up some ideas that maybe we can have a conversation going forward in terms of community engagement when it comes to border conversations and when it comes to regional responses. So the reality is when we talk about the Horn, we are actually talking about, once again, a new scramble for the region. It's more by default than maybe some can argue than by design. From the discussions earlier this morning, the various regional responses to conflict have been through international organizations, be it INGOs or funding partners, UN, and governments also within the region and also outside the regions. I think one has to look and have an honest conversation in terms of who is engaging and what the interests are. And I think that was alluded to earlier this morning, whether it's economic interests, security or political configurations, or ideological interests as well. When we talk about the Horn and we talk about regional responses, as was mentioned in the various discussions this morning, we specifically look at the African Union and IGAD and a lot of conversations around that. And when we look at that, we're looking specifically at various peace support operations, be it AMISOM, or the diplomatic dialogue responses, such as the peace agreements discussions from South Sudan, Sudan, or Ethiopia. If we can start off with the African Union, I think there was a lot of elation when we transitioned from the OAU, the Organization of African Unity, to the African Union in 2022, which marked an important shift towards consolidating African peace and security, particularly when it came to the African peace and security architecture. So when we look at the APSA, we have the Peace and Security Council. There's a lot of conversation around it. The main decision-making body, which consists of the panel of the WISE, the Continental Early Warning System that was also questioned earlier this morning, the Africa Standby Force, which my colleague Chido will also possibly speak to. The responsibility of the Peace and Security Council is basically to mandate the regional interventions on behalf of the AU and basically approves the modalities to restore peace and harmonize activities in the Horn. But then it can't be done in silo. So the Peace and Security Council also uses the RECs on the continent. And in this specific case, I'm referring to IGAD in terms of the mandates for peace and security and other issues, human security issues in the Horn of Africa. So IGAD is a component of the APSA. It's seen as potentially an intermediary of sorts between the national governments as well as the AU. So whatever IGAD proposes or presents is then sent back up to the AU for possibly final decision making. It plays a strong potential role when it comes to conflict resolution and peace building in the Horn, or does it? I think from the conversations this morning, some argued it does not. I think we've also agreed that the conflicts that we're experiencing in the Horn are not confined to national states. There's a lot of spillover effects. And IGAD has the big task of creating sub-regional mechanisms within its structure for conflict prevention, management, and resolution through various forms such as dialogue. So its conflict resolution efforts have been witnessed through the CPA agreement and in the Sudans, Somalia, the peace processes in Somalia. And it's also responsible, obviously, for the engagement when we speak of the Horn of Africa. Despite the visible responses by different regional actors, mainly the AU and IGAD, we have to also ask ourselves how far these responses have actually enhanced peace in the region, if they have at all. The region, once again, remains fragile. Are they holistic and inclusive in terms of the responses? Are they context-specific or are they cut and paste? Is that where the challenges are? Are they sustainable? And do they reflect the realities from the ground? All the realities from the ground. For the Life and Peace Institute, where I work, we believe that the missing link specifically in the responses in the region has always been when it comes to community voices. And I think our partners from UNDP ABC had also alluded to this during their interventions earlier this morning. And I think Abel had also mentioned that there's a need to potentially look at the architecture and look at how we can have the subnational community structures, looking specifically at the grassroots level, and also realistically appreciating and recognizing how they have been overlooked, how community voices have actually been neglected when it comes to regional responses or some of the solutions that are coming out of the Horn. If given the space, could these community voices make a difference? could our policy responses move away from an elite position or an elite approach, which tends to overlook the fundamental reasons as to why we are where we are today? Our global and regional work at the Life and Peace Institute seeks to address some of these issues, where we take the voices on the ground, the community voices, the unheard voices, and try to elevate these when it comes to global conversations. And this we do for more effective policy engagement, which we hope will respond effectively to peace and security concerns when it comes to the Horn. We definitely recognize that as part of our peace-building approach, we need to be more coherent. We need to also establish stronger institutions. So earlier in the morning, I think Abel had mentioned the fact that, do we completely come up with a complete institution? I would beg to disagree. I would potentially put forward the question, do we come up with a new institution, or do we consider strengthening what we currently have? Is it possible to strengthen what we currently have? Or do we go back to the basics and start once again? And how long will it take us to grow and to support our peace and security work in the Horn of Africa? So as interested stakeholders in the room today, I'd want to ask if we can consider the need to support and possibly strengthen a possible three-tier approach when it comes to IGAD. I think IGAD is currently doing something similar when it comes to looking at the national level, the regional level, and the continental level. That three-tier approach, when I talk about the national level, can we have a trickle-down approach where we actually have the voices on the ground that are actually elevated and brought into the conversation and the decision-making tables, as opposed to limiting this to the elites? When we talk about the special envoys that we have to the Horn, who are they speaking to when it comes to finding durable solutions on in the Horn of Africa? Are they speaking to the people on the ground? Are they speaking to the people in the border areas? I think this approach of a three-tier approach, once consolidated, could potentially allow us to be more inclusive as well as deliberate in finding durable solutions to the challenges that we continue to face. Therefore, my argument is that institutional strengthening in terms of IGAD, for example, institutional strengthening, if need be, in terms of the AU. The AU is currently undergoing a reform process. How do we take advantage of that process, if the time allows, to allow for legitimacy in the Horn of Africa? If you institute a three-tier approach, where you can give certain responsibilities and certain functions at the three-tier level. I'm speaking primarily to the principle of subsidiarity, where certain functions are given to the national level with a trickle-down approach, and other functions given to the RECs, while other functions also given to the AU. I want to reiterate that when it comes to IGAD and the AU, they are only as strong as the member states. So if there is no interest in member states in finding durable solutions on the Horn of Africa, then we're not going to advance our cause. However, how do we incorporate civil society voices, be they the silent voices in the borderlands area, to come into this conversation, to put the relevant pressure, whether it's on national government and then moving bottom up, so to speak, but not from a political perspective from the Kenyan context. So the current top-down process excludes marginalized groups, which include women, which include young people, which form about 60% of the population in the region when we speak about the Horn, and which also exclude the border voices as well. The global instability also poses a major challenge, as we're witnessing the Ukraine and Russia conflict, and what that means in terms of the focus of the international community when it comes to the Horn. There's also the reality of the fatigue on prolonged crisis in the region, and then non-cooperation of the elite and governments when in the Horn, as well as the challenges that we've also encountered when it comes to COVID-19. What do we need? We need a vision where it is not possible for us to plan and prepare if we do not have a critical analysis, which was also mentioned earlier in terms of the research that we're doing. We need to engage local communities and marginalized groups, especially in the borderlands area. We need to include the unheard voices, and we need to find innovative ways to work with local partners and build local networks when it comes to the various responses, be it IGAD's early warning response, which was also mentioned here, and then also have those honest conversations. Early response leads to early action. But realistically speaking, and if we have people sitting in this room who are actually donors, maybe who can share and tell us the reality, would you invest more in early warning or in mediation and peace building thereafter? I think what we have found is that donors and funding partners tend to prefer, so to speak, to put funding into action and not necessarily when it comes to early action or early warning, because I think it's also a bit harder to convince one that the situation will actually become as dire as it ends up becoming, unless people actually see it for themselves. So what we need is sustained commitment from various actors. We need resources in the Horn, whether human and financial. We need goodwill as well as political will. And we need policies that can be developed to advance our strategic ideas. We need collaboration in all peace-building initiatives that we have to appreciate that we can no longer work in silos. And we need inclusivity of all actors in the process, from the community level up, as well as meaningful engagement and partnerships, seeking genuine collaborations and not merely being seen to include, but genuinely creating the relevant space. So to conclude, the security of tomorrow is in the plans and the vision and the action that we put in place today. We need locally driven processes, which need to be sustainable. We need external actors who have a role to play in supporting local actors. If regional actors replace local capacities, that's a short-term gain and unsustainable. If local capacities lead processes are meaningful and inclusive, then we will have local ownership and sustainability as their footprint in the process, which will become visible. Locally owned and locally driven for sustainability of any meaningful peace-building process must demonstrate inclusivity, and failure to do so, the cycle continues.
Super, thank you very much there, Martha. A strong case for principles of subsidiarity. Handing over to you, Chido, if you can keep it short, please. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Zoe and Martha. So because Martha spoke on the principle of subsidiarity and the APSA, I think that's sort of provided a good foundation from me to speak on the militarization of responses to conflicts through the African Standby Force, which is a component of APSA. And I'm going to be looking at the East African community and the Southern African Development Community, the interventions in DRC and the interventions in Mozambique. My presentation is going to be in 3 parts. So firstly, I'll be looking at the motivations or the drivers for regional organizations to implement militarized solutions to cross-border conflicts. And then I'll be looking at the prospects of importing this model into East Africa and the Horn. And then I'll finally just end my intervention by looking at the implications of this model for international actors. So in terms of the drivers for the militarization of responses to cross-border conflict, I just want to point out that this isn't the first, the intervention in DRC and in Mozambique. I mean, there have been regional military coalitions before. And some of the 2 main features is the question of sovereignty and political interests. And so in my other research that I'm doing with XCEPT, where we're looking at peace support operations, we know that their mandate ends at the border, so they can't cross over into neighboring countries. And in any case, the question of sovereignty really remains a very sensitive and very acknowledged norm on the continent. And so in this case, this is a way in which regional organizations and the African Union are balancing the question of sovereignty and the need to address spillover of conflicts. And so just to give you like an example is when you look at the attempt to deploy MAPROBU to Burundi in 2018, the failure of that attempt versus the fact that DRC actually goes to the EAC and says, could you please send troops? So you see that balance between sovereignty and political interests. And so the operationalization of the African Standby Force has really sort of brought this motivated regional organizations to use military forces. But in looking at that operationalization, it's also happened amidst the institutional reforms in the African Union, and as well the changes in the. Can you hear me clearly? I feel like there's an echo. Sorry, I'm hearing an echo. Yeah, sorry. So in looking at that, it has come in the midst of the institutional reforms within the African Union, the operationalization of the Peace Fund, and as well the changing dynamics between the relationship between regional organizations and the African Union. And so what we've seen with the current deployments is that they haven't followed the procedures that are set up on the African standby manual. So in this case, it's the African Union that's actually supposed to be the leading actor. But what we've seen SADC announce that it's going to deploy troops to Mozambique and then take what is already a decision to the African Union to authorize. The same thing with the East African Standby Force in Burundi, is that in DRC, is that the decision and the authorization were made at regional level, and what the AU actually did was simply stamp what had already been decided, despite the fact that it was originally conceived to be the other way around. And so what are the prospects of having this type of intervention happening in East Africa and the Horn? I think the first thing that I will note is that there is most likely would be the EAC leading the Air Force, because that's the one that has a standby force. And there is a tendency of specialization between the regs, and that often brings out a good foundation for complementarity. Speaking specifically to the EAC, is that the EAC, for example, has had a good relationship with COMESA in terms of early warning systems, where COMESA's early warning system focuses more on structural prevention, and the EAC's one is more of a preventive diplomacy type of early warning. So in this case, then that would mean that we are looking at more coordination between EGAD and EAC, because what is often lacking in the military responses is that there isn't a well thought out political strategy or that strategic planning of how to then manage some of the drivers of cross-border conflict, because we know that military solutions are not often effective in the long term. I would suspect that because of that, in the region, there would be less opportunities for forum shopping, which you have seen DRC do. So now DRC has the East African Standby Force. We're also hearing that SADC is going to deploy, but within East Africa and the Horn, there would be fewer opportunities for that type of forum shopping. And I also think that there wouldn't be likely to be, in the long-term, community support for militarized solutions. You've already seen the type of backlash that UN peace support operations are getting, and it is likely that we're going to see similar things. There was already protests in DRC against the East African Standby Force, and so this would be a dynamic that would likely to show up in the Horn. I also think that another factor in this region is would also be, I think, the lack of an interested hegemon. You find that Kenya, which is considered the hegemon, has not really been very, has not been very motivated, I think, to take on that role. When you look, for example, at the role that South Africa played in the initial deployment of the SAMIM to Mozambique was that South Africa did actually put in a lot of the finances and a lot of equipment. Whereas currently looking at the situation in Ethiopia, in Sudan, and then Kenya not being that interested, it does make it a little bit difficult. I do think that the operationalization of the Peace Fund, especially in terms of the Crisis Reserve Facility, would actually, though alleviate some of the initial funding challenges that we see in terms of troop deployments. Now, the question, it would be now moving on to the implications for international actors. So international actors cannot ignore this trend, because looking at it, I do think that we are going to see similar type of deployments, despite some of the negative, the risks that come with these deployments. And I would say that precedent has already been set by the European Union in their change from the African Peace Facility to the European Peace Facility in terms of directly funding type of military operations at regional level without going through the African Union. But what this would mean for international actors would be navigating regional dynamics on subsidiarity at a very sensitive time for the African Union and regional organizations. And so in directly funding regional type of deployments without going through the AU, I think international actors would expose themselves to some of the tensions that are already going on between the continental and regional levels. I think to finalize, I would think that for international actors, it would be good for them to, in supporting military responses, to look at a way of motivating greater collaboration between a military solution by something like the EAC versus a mediation process that is going on by IGAD. I'll end there. Thank you.
Super, thank you very much, Chido. Abel, you're going to make a brief intervention reflecting on the Ethiopian conflict and the role of international actors. So 5 or so minutes for you, please.
Thank you so much. I'll try to be as brief as I can. Probably it's much better to start from the line of argument that I have for this session. I argue that the role of regional and international actors when it comes to conflict prevention was largely ineffective, and that includes some of the regional mechanisms that have been discussed from this morning, including the Africa Union, IGAD, and to some extent UN and / United Nations Security Council. But I also want to admit that some of the mechanisms have played a crucial role in finding some sort of resolution in Ethiopia and Sudan's case, but most importantly in Ethiopia's case, following the Tigray war in particular. And I think there are several factors that can be mentioned why these mechanisms were largely ineffective or came a little too late. But I think it's also important to note that we need to be reminded how the conflict in Ethiopia has evolved through time in our eyes, and no one did anything meaningful to stop it. So we were having this conversation with Khulud this morning based on the conversations that we had about a year ago in Khartoum, that it was very much visible that this is going to happen, but nothing was done or nothing appropriate was done to prevent it. So that was also the case is in Ethiopia's case. Zoe vividly remembers our discussions in the embassy. And I think having an effective early warning mechanisms and also having a concerted effort and coordinated effort still, because it's still, I argue that is an elusive dream. So I think there has to be a thorough interrogation of why regional and continental and also international mechanisms did not live up to expectations and objectives that they set for themselves. And For all of you who've been following the Ethiopian case in particular, as I said earlier, did not happen overnight. And according to some researcher who rightly observed it, it was like two trains wreck in slow motion, but sorry, but no one did anything meaningful to stop it. So I think as much as the local actors who have failed miserably to stop the war and also to minimize the damage, I think there has to be a thorough investigation on how we can basically improve these mechanisms somehow in the future. But I think there are important elements that need to be discussed in discussing why these mechanisms did not work the way they were supposed to work. In my view, one of the main important element is traditional actors have increasingly retreating from having an active role in this part of the world. By traditional actors, what I mean is the West, in particularly the US, the EU as a bloc, and in prominent EU member states, even if actually, albeit that coordination was still weak some years back, but it's becoming more and more weak and more fragmented, particularly since the election of Trump, after the Brexit, and the influence and rise of actually radical groups in many European countries. The commitment to multilateralism and also contribution towards humanitarian peace and security issues has significantly been weakened. And that created a room for new emerging actors. I think Kedrick mentioned some of the actors earlier in the morning, including the Gulf plus Turkey and some other actors. These actors are different in a way they respond to the conflict. They are quick to jump in, but perhaps in most cases without properly understanding the situation, and also based on personal interests, personal relationship with the leadership that they have with respective countries in this part of the world. But we also see a complete lack of coordination between the West, who've been actually actively engaging vis-a-vis the new actors that I have mentioned now. There is also, I think, when it comes to intervention following the Iraq and Afghanistan misadventure, there is lots of hesitation, partly rightly so, but this has also been exploited heavily by some of the regimes in this part of the world, including actually some of the slogans that we've observed in Ethiopia's case, when accountability and justice was being called for. So I think there has to be a mechanism that we can navigate through this in one way or another. And one other thing that I also have to mention is new actors, particularly at local level, have started to emerge in the last 3 or 4 years. And particularly in Ethiopia's case, the most prominent actors are largely new. And the current chief of staff, the current intelligence minister, and many others are not known to many important actors, not only actually international, but also regional actors. So I think that has created a vacuum in terms of the communication, the collaboration, and working together. And there has to be, I believe, an investment to establish this infrastructure. And also the elephant in the room is the Russia war and the resultant, depending on actually how you call it, is creating a room for some of the worst totalitarian and authoritarian regimes to exploit this dynamics, and it's also having a huge impact, a huge toll on humanitarian issues, also in achieving concerted and coordinated effort to respond to humanitarian crisis, but also the conflict issues that we are having at the moment. So having said that, I think I want to quickly discuss what can be done as much as it sounds a cliche, but I think there has to be an improved coordination between regional and international actors on one hand, but also between these actors and the local actors that we're having in this part of the world. I think we all have observed how many times the Horn envoys by numerous entities have visited Riyadh, Doha, and Abu Dhabi in the last 1 or 2 years. But that attempt to coordinate did not bring any fruit, at least to the people who've been observing in terms of actually mitigating the conflict, in finding resolutions to it. So I think there has to be an infrastructure to discuss, to deliberate, and also to challenge some of these new actors on the way that they're dealing with the crisis in this part of the world. And at the heart of it is also the lack of accountability. I think the mantra is now winning by hook or crook will get the regimes survive. Perhaps they know at the end of the day the international community will have no options but also to come back as a rapprochement. So I think there has to be accountability not only to the regimes, to the actors, but also the new emerging actors who have been actively playing a role in fueling the conflict at some point, providing ammunitions that's been targeting not only military facilities but also civilian infrastructure. So I think coordination and ensuring some sort of accountability is a must. I wanted to unpack on some of the things that I said, but I don't think the chairperson would allow me. Let me stop here. Thank you.